Well, good morning, folks. I so appreciate every time we come together here, the music and the prayer time that we have, and appreciate Gary and Jan's leadership today. I don't know about you, I can't make it from weekend to weekend with just one worship. I need I need more than that, and I receive at least some of that when we come together. Excuse me, by the way, I'm still sucking cough drops. Got rid of that one. I always wanted a bass voice, but I didn't want to get sick to get it. But actually, I'm not sick anymore, so, you know, it's just the lingering cough. It's that kind of deal. By the way, there's a story. I just remembered it. Story about a pastor that preached for 20 minutes every single week. He would time him. He was just uncanny. Just 20 minutes, never more, never less. And you know, and it was so amazing that somebody in the church one time asked him. He said, "Pastor, how is it that it's always 20 minutes, never longer, never shorter?" He said, "Well, I wasn't going to tell you, but I do have a little secret." He says, "I have a cough drop, and I put it here, and it takes 20 minutes for that thing to dissolve. And so when it's completely dissolved, I know it's time to quit." And so he was thanked for that piece of information. And then the following week, he got the 20 minutes, and he was still going. And he got to 25, and he was still going. He got to 30, and he was still going. He got to 40, and he was still going. And finally, he sat down, and somebody said, "Well, Pastor, what happened? Normally it's just 20 minutes and you sit down." He said, "Well, I thought I was putting a cough drop in my mouth, but," he said, "I had a shirt button, and I put it there." Well, gang, you are in luck this morning. I bet you didn't know when you got up that today is BOGO Day. You know what that is? That's buy one, get one, which means, of course, that you get 2 lessons today for the price of 1. 2 lessons from the Bible at no extra charge. It won't take any extra time, by the way, if you have plans for lunch. So you're just really, seriously, you are one lucky group of people here. I was going to talk to you today about John Mark, and I am going to talk to you about John Mark. But folks, before we get to John Mark, I want to talk to you about something that's been hanging over our heads for quite a while now, actually over a month, basically ever since we started this study. It's been hanging over my head anyway, and that's this whole troublesome Saul-Paul deal. And a lot of you have been asking me, "Well, when are you going to talk about that?" And I was just kind of hoping that we would take care of that. It just kind of happened. But I found out that it hasn't just happened. And so I think what we need to do is just deal with it. Besides, to tell you the truth, I'm kind of tired of saying Saul when I mean Paul, and Paul when I mean Saul, and you're probably tired about that, part of that too. So let's take a deep breath and deal with it, and then we'll be done with it, okay? The thing is, friends, is that we, and by that I mean almost all of us, if not everybody, including myself, the thing is that we have gotten it all wrong. I've been checking it out. We've gotten it all wrong on the Saul-Paul deal. We really have. We were taught in Sunday school, most of us, I'm thinking, I certainly was, that a man named Saul had such a profoundly life-changing experience when he met Jesus Christ that his name was immediately changed to Paul. And you got to admit, that makes for a great story. It really does. Seriously, what could possibly point to or announce a bigger change in a person, a bigger transformation within a person, than a change in that person's name? I mean, I don't know about you, but what I was taught by my Sunday school teachers They were Methodists, of course, so that might have had something to do with it. But what I was taught in Sunday school was that this man called Saul was so mean and so hateful toward Christians that when he himself became a Christian, absolutely nothing from his former life, not a single thing from his previous kind of life, fit him or suited him anymore. And so he just had to get a new name. Now, I admit that as an 8-year-old, it was kind of hard for me to get my cute little head around that idea that anybody would or even could ever get a new name. Names, I thought, were given at birth, and you pretty much got what you got. But my Sunday school teacher said that Saul became Paul when he saw Jesus on the Damascus Road. And well, I figured, well, Sunday school teacher wouldn't lie to me. And so that had to be it. So I just grew up believing that, even when I went to college. And beyond that, later on, when I went to seminary, I learned, or I thought I learned, that Saul became Paul almost immediately. Now, I'm sure my professors told me differently, but I was kind of interested in this girl I had met called Rita, and so I probably missed it. And so when I became a preacher at 25 years of age, as young as you could possibly be a preacher in that tradition, well, that's what I preached. Because that's what I thought was true, that Saul became Paul just like that. And folks, I've got to tell you that particular understanding of mine, that Saul became Paul in an instant, that understanding made for some really great preaching. It really did. Seriously. Saul, I used to say to my congregation, in just a heartbeat on the road to Damascus, went from being the biggest opponent of the Christian faith to being the biggest proponent of the Christian faith. And right then and there, he became Paul. That's a great line, isn't it? I made that up. All by myself. Problem was, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. Many of us, if not most of us, even a lot of lifelong Christians, including a lot of preachers, have gotten it all wrong. Guys, let me ask you, is it all right if I teach in this study what the Bible actually says? I ask that because I run across a lot of people, I actually have, a lot of good Christian people who think they know what the Bible says when the Bible really doesn't actually say it, because they've never really looked at it all that carefully. So I'm just wondering if I have your permission to say what the Bible really says. See, the fact of the matter is, friends, that Saul's transformation to Paul, his name change from Saul to Paul, did not happen right there on the Damascus Road, nor even a few days later. Oh, don't get me wrong. Saul did meet the risen Jesus Christ. He most certainly did that day on his way to Damascus, when he was almost all the way to Damascus. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. We know that for sure. Luke tells us that in the book of Acts, and Paul himself confirms that in his letters. But the fact of the matter is that experience, that event, listen, gang, what happened there on the Damascus Road was only the beginning of the conversion process that took at least 3 days. You remember what happened, of course. We looked at this several weeks ago. Ananias, the reluctant healer of the 9th chapter of the book of Acts, Ananias spoke to Saul and laid his hands on Saul, the most scary thing he ever did, which restored Saul's sight and then led Saul to be baptized. That's the story. But even then, guys, you need to look at the Bible carefully. Even then, Saul did not become Paul. Now remember, when Ananias visits Saul 3 days after Saul saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, which you could say was Saul's conversion to Christianity, or at least the beginning of his conversion to Christianity, what does Ananias call him in Acts 9, verse 17? Don't bother turning there. You won't get there before I tell you, unless you're a lifelong Baptist. What does Ananias call Saul? When Ananias lays hands on him, he calls him brother Saul with an S. In other words, Saul is still Saul after seeing Jesus. Saul is still Saul after the scales, or what Luke says, whatever it was that looked like scales, fell from his eyes, so he could see again. And Saul is still Saul even after he was then baptized. Now, baptism is a huge thing, right? You might think that getting baptized would have been the perfect time for Saul to get a new name, if it hadn't already happened by then. But it didn't happen. Not even then. No, through it all, he remains Saul. I hate to burst your bubble, but your Sunday school teacher was wrong if he or she told you that Saul became Paul when he saw Jesus on the Damascus road. Your Sunday school teacher was nice. I'm sure well-intentioned. Waiting for you in heaven, I'm sure. But wrong. The transformation from Saul to Paul, his name change from Saul to Paul, didn't happen then. And gang, the fact of the matter is that Luke, who is, of course, the writer of the book of Acts, and really our only source of information about Saul, other than Saul or Paul himself in his letters, the fact is that Luke doesn't seem to be in all that much of a hurry to tell us about how or when Saul became Paul, or even that it was a very big deal when it finally did happen. Fact is, after Saul's conversion and his baptism in the 9th chapter of Acts, Luke continues to call him Saul a total of 13 times, and Paul not even once, until the 13th chapter of Acts, or almost halfway through the book of Acts. In other words, friends, it's Saul and only Saul until Acts 13, and Paul and only Paul after Acts 13. And when Luke finally does call Saul Paul, well, let's just say he doesn't treat it as earth-shaking news. Turn, please, to Acts chapter 13, verse 9. When you get there, Acts 13:9, you'll see just how thrilled Luke is to tell us that Saul has a new name, which is not very thrilled at all, as a matter of fact. What's going on here, just to kind of fill you in, is that Saul and Barnabas are on the island of Cyprus, and Saul is confronting a man named Elymas. Now, don't pay any attention at all right now to Elymas. He's just a bit player. But look at what Luke says. Then Saul, we're Acts 13:9, then Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked straight at Elymas and said, "You are a child of the devil and an enemy of everything that is right." Now, that's kind of interesting, but like I said, forget about Elymas right now, and look at what Saul or Paul said. What Luke said about Saul. Look instead at how Luke tells us that Saul is now also known as Paul. See any fireworks there? You know, big deal. Any fanfares? You know, you'd think that Luke might have made a big deal out of that, wouldn't you? Saul has become Paul, the author of half of the New Testament. But instead, Luke manages to make it seem almost like an afterthought. Like maybe he should have put it in parentheses. When I was in Sunday school, I'm telling you, it was a big deal. A huge deal when Saul became Paul. And now Luke says, by the way, Saul was also called Paul. It's almost like Luke says that he could have told us that news just about at any time, but, now seems like the proper time. Like I say, Luke's not in much of a hurry, or even all that excited to tell us about how Saul became Paul. In fact, gang, if you really want to know, Saul didn't become Paul. If you look at the book of Acts carefully, Saul didn't become Paul for around 4 years. If you look at a timeline of his life, the fact of the matter is that Saul spent a lot of time, an awful lot of time, going various places. Places like Damascus and Arabia and Jerusalem and Caesarea and Tarsus and Antioch, and then back to Jerusalem, and then on his first missionary journey, they took him to places like Seleucia and Salamis and Cyprus, places like that, and all those places on foot, by the way, so it took him a long time. Unless occasionally he was sailing on the Mediterranean. Saul did all that traveling before he was ever called Paul. But even that's not all. And gang, here's the real shocker. Look at what Luke says. Saul never really ever actually became Paul. He just got to a point where he was also called Paul. Almost as if he had an alias, or you should have called him Saul, a.k.a. Paul. That rumbling sound you may hear right now is the sound of a million Sunday school teachers rolling over in their graves. Friends, let me tell you what most likely happened. Saul, of course, was a Hebrew name. It was, in fact, the name of Israel's first king. So it was an honor to be named Saul. Paul, on the other hand, was a fairly common Roman name. Now, obviously, those two names were fairly similar, just one letter different, S and P. But that's really not unusual when it comes to names in different languages. For example, the man's name John in English is Juan in Spanish, almost the same, at least it sounds almost the same. The woman's name Mary in English is Maria in Spanish, again, almost the same. And if you go to another country, you may have experienced this, especially to live there for any length of time, like Saul did, you might be inclined, just to make things easier for the people living there, you might just want to go by a name that's better known or more familiar or accepted in that country. So the deal is that when Saul was in Jerusalem and in other parts of Israel and in the Hebrew-speaking world, the name Saul was a great name. The name of King Saul. It worked just fine. That was his given name. But when Saul traveled to other parts of the world, further and further away from Israel, especially into parts of the Roman Empire, as he did more and more often in order to take the Christian faith to more and more places, he didn't want his Hebrew name to get in the way of people hearing and accepting the gospel. And so he started going by his Roman name of Paul. He was a Roman citizen, you remember. And friends, that, as another Paul Harvey, used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. Good day. Folks, believe it or not, that's probably how it happened. One more name. This is kind of interesting. The Greek word salos, S-A-U-L-O-S. The Greek word salos was an adjective that meant mincing, which was a word back then. It still is a word, actually. You can look it up in your dictionary. The word mincing, that a word that's sometimes used to describe a man. I'm just going to say it like it is. Bob talked about leaking last week. I guess I can just tell you. So it was a word that this mincing was a word used to describe a man who walks like a woman might walk. With a little, I'm not going to demonstrate, but there are some scholars who say that a man named Saul back then, S-A-U-L, might just have wanted to avoid any teasing he might have gotten about his name in the Greek-speaking world. One more reason to go by Paul. If I've messed with your faith too much this morning by telling you what the Bible says instead of what you thought it said, sorry. only sort of sorry, actually, but you know, how Saul became Paul, or when Saul became Paul, is really not that important. It's important enough for us to spend some time with it this morning, because we've heard about it for so long. And because it fascinates us, but what really matters is what kind of man Paul became and what he did. So, on to John Mark. If you were here last week, you remember, I hope you remember, that John Mark was Barnabas's cousin. And we know that, not because either John Mark or Barnabas tell us that, but because Paul himself tells us that in his letter to the Colossians. We don't know, by the way, whether John Mark and Barnabas were first cousins or second cousins or fourth cousins twice removed, whatever that means. I mean, who even cares about stuff like that? But the thing to remember is that they were cousins of some sort. You'll also remember, I trust, that John Mark was the one person solely responsible, the one and only reason, actually, for Paul and Barnabas going their separate ways. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with him on their second missionary journey, and Paul didn't. They each had their reasons for wanting or not wanting John Mark to go along. If you don't remember those reasons, your table leaders are experts on that. You can talk to them. But the deal was that as Luke calls it, a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas over whether or not to include John Mark on their second missionary journey, and that disagreement was so sharp and so vehement that Paul and Barnabas saw no other solution than to split up and to go their separate ways. I also said a little bit about John Mark's name last week, as you may recall. Fact of the matter is, as you know, gang, that there were just a whole lot of Johns back then. I mean, there were Johns everywhere. And no, I'm not going to say anything more about that either. But it's true. There were Johns back then, including, of course, two very famous Johns, John the Baptist and John the son of Zebedee, who turned out to be one of Jesus' disciples. This particular John, John Mark, was, as I said last week, never actually called John Mark in the Bible, which probably adds to the confusion. Sometimes he's called John, sometimes he's called Mark, and sometimes he's called John, also called Mark, in order to distinguish him from all the other Johns out there at that time. There are no other Marks, by the way. But he is, in fact, never even once in the Bible actually called John Mark, even though that's what we call him. And so what that means, friends, is that it's necessary when you talk about this particular John, this John also called Mark, this man whom Christians have called Mark, it's necessary to sort through or to sift through about 160 times when the name John is mentioned in the New Testament. So let's look at each one of those 160 times. Just seeing if you're awake. Actually, other people, scholars, who apparently have a lot of time on their hands, other people have already sorted out all those Johns for us. And what that means, as far as I'm concerned this morning, is that I'd like you to trust me, please, if you would, when I say that I'm talking about this particular John, the John we call John Mark, because what I'm doing is I'm trusting a lot of others who've done that research before me. So we know three things about John Mark so far. We know that John Mark and Barnabas were cousins. We know that Paul and Barnabas disagreed over whether or not to take John Mark on their second missionary journey. And we know that John Mark was not the only John in the New Testament. That's what we know for sure. There are, perhaps, maybe a few other things that we can learn about John Mark, though. Turn, please, to Acts chapter 12, verse 11. When you get there, you'll see that this is mostly a story about Peter. Peter the disciple, Peter the leader of the early church, who had just escaped from prison and was looking for a place to stay, a place to hide out. Follow along, starting with the 11th verse. Acts 12, starting at 11. Now, then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches." This is what he's saying to himself after he's escaped from prison, and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen. When this had dawned on him, on Peter, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed, she ran back without opening and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." If you're, the Bible's sometimes pretty funny, Peter. Then they leave Peter there and go tell everybody that Peter's there, right? "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said it must be his angel. Meantime, Peter's still standing there, knocking at the door. But when Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Now the story goes on from there. We're not talking about Peter in this study. If you want to hear about Peter, you should have been here last year. What this story tells us, gang, you got to look at it carefully, is that John Mark's mother was named Mary. Obviously a common name for women back then. And it's assumed that she was a fairly wealthy woman. Why? Because Luke tells us she had a house large enough to hold many people who, Luke tells us, just happened to be there at her house at that exact time. There were, in fact, Luke tells us, the people who were there right then, they were praying together in Mary's house, which might have meant that they were in a house church, which was a very common thing back then, by the way. Christians that didn't have a place of their own, couldn't afford a place of their own, any place large enough to gather, they would meet in a large house. So we know that it was a large house, and it was large enough to accommodate what Luke says were many people, and in fact it was a house large enough to employ a servant whom Mary could evidently afford, named Rhoda. Mary, therefore, we're just guessing, but it's an educated guess, Mary, therefore, probably had some money. And it's possible that she may have given some of that money to her son, John Mark. We don't know, but possibly. Or maybe he had come across in some other way. And it's further possible that John Mark may have used some of that money to help finance Paul's first missionary journey. That's all conjecture, of course. We're just guessing. But that's possible. Turn now, please, to Acts chapter 12, verse 25. Acts 12:25. When you get there, you'll see that Luke tells us when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. What does that say? Ben? What does that mean? It simply confirms what we already know, and that's that John was a traveling partner of Paul and Barnabas. Turn now, please, to Acts chapter 13. 4th and 5th verses, Acts 13, 4, 5, where Paul and Barnabas are traveling together on their first missionary journey. The two of them, Paul and Barnabas, sent on their way by the Holy Spirit, went down to Seleucia and sailed from there to Cyprus. And when they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. John, whom we know as John Mark, John was with them as their helper. So the deal is that this too confirms that John Mark traveled with Paul and Barnabas even on their first missionary journey, and it tells us that John Mark went along as some kind of helper. Speculation is that he perhaps helped with travel arrangements, or maybe he carried bags, but we do know that he was a helper of some kind. Acts 13:13 tells us that John Mark left that first missionary journey. We looked at that last week, you'll recall, which was really, of course, the final straw as far as Paul was concerned. Acts 13:13, from Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. Acts 15:36 through 41, chapter 15, 36, 41, is, of course, all about the split between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark. We won't read that again. We talked about that last week, but it's there if you want to look at it. You know, folks, I thought a lot about this story since last week. This particular part of the story. Like I say, even since last week. And I can't help wondering how much all of this that happens in this 15th chapter, verses 36 through 41, where Paul and Barnabas split up, I can't help but wonder how that must have hurt Barnabas a lot. To see his friend and his protege, Paul, who wouldn't have gotten anywhere without Barnabas, then reject John Mark like Paul did. It wasn't so much that John Mark was his cousin, but that John Mark probably reminded Barnabas of another young man, not all that many years ago, as a matter of fact, a young man named Saul at that time, who, to tell you the truth, also had a lot of rough edges and a whole lot of problems. But the deal is, or was, that Barnabas never gave up on Saul, did he? Not even once. He rescued Saul when Saul needed rescuing and might not have lived without it. He mentored Paul when Paul needed a whole lot of mentoring. He introduced Saul to the major leaders of the church back then. He gave Saul some opportunities to speak. So many opportunities, in fact, that Saul became actually a better speaker than Barnabas himself. He molded Saul and he shaped Saul into the leader that he eventually became. In so many ways, Barnabas, had literally bent over backwards to take a brash and new young believer named Saul to where one day that Saul would become Paul the Apostle. And now here's that same Paul who is unwilling to take a chance on another young man named John Mark. I'm not saying that Paul was wrong, mind you. He was, after all, the genius behind the explosive growth of the church in the first century. But I can't help feeling a little sorry for Barnabas, knowing how much he had personally invested in Paul, and how maybe he now wanted to invest just as much in another young man named John Mark. But Paul wouldn't have it. Thought a lot about that this past week. Turn, please, to 2 Timothy. Skip ahead to 2 Timothy, please. 4th chapter, verse 11. When you get there, you'll see how Paul, when he was in prison, very close to the end of his life, when Paul was in prison and waiting actually to be executed, how Paul, writing what was most likely his very last letter, his second letter to Timothy, at least any of the letters that we have in the New Testament, how Paul almost begged Timothy to come and see him before he died, and to bring along with him, when he came, John Mark. Do your best, Paul says, as he writes Timothy, do your best to come to me quickly. Or Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Demas was a friend that had been with Paul for a long time. Just, you could count on him until you couldn't. And then he left. And so Demas is gone. And then Paul says, Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Paul's got one friend with him, Luke. So he says to Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. Paul wrote that letter to Timothy, his second letter to Timothy, before he wrote Acts, most likely. But what you got to remember is that Luke is writing history, and what Luke wrote about Paul took place long before Paul ever wrote his words. Not about you, but what that looks like to me is that Paul might have finally come around. Maybe he mellowed in his old age. There was a time when he couldn't take a chance on John Mark. But now in his old age, in prison, and awaiting death, he desperately needed some friends. He needed Luke and Timothy, and even John Mark. We don't know if John Mark ever got there to see Paul again, but we do know that Paul wanted to see John Mark again. And that counts for something, I guess. There are a couple more references to John Mark in the New Testament, one by Paul in his letter to Philemon, where it appears that John Mark is actually with him at that time. Another one in the first of Peter's 2 letters, where Peter writes, where Peter calls John Mark his son, which probably was more a term of endearment than anything else. Legend has it that John Mark turned out to be the writer of the book of Mark, one of the 4 Gospels, although he was not, of course, a disciple or a witness to the things that Jesus did. So if that's true, what that means is that he wrote the Gospel according to Mark, probably from what Peter told him. Legend also has it that John Mark might have much later, become a bishop in the early church. When it comes to stuff like that, though, we just don't know for sure. What we do know, what we think we know, is that John Mark matured. Paul matured. And so hopefully do we all. Talk around your tables, please.